So a French army in blue here, led by Lautrec, continues to clash with a combined Spanish Papal army, not under any overall commander. Here at the Battle of Bicocca, the game is Crossbows and Cannon 1. It's part of the Royalist and Roundhead series designed by Robert Markham and published by 3W. Definitely a, I guess, low complexity game. Yeah, okay. Or maybe complexity isn't the right word. But anyways, what really makes the game for me is two things. One is the order system. So all of these formations here in the battle, all the formations are under a current one of 6 orders. Attack, advance, and stand. Kind of straightforward. So attack, advance, and stand. Stand being basically defend. And then you have retreat, reserve, and muster. Still haven't figured out, I've mentioned this before, I'll say it again, I still haven't figured out when or even why you would use a retreat command. Except maybe if you were trying to save your forces, but well, that's the only thing I can think of. And when I play solo, I don't really ever contemplate a retreat, because when I'm playing solo, I'm just trying to push each army hard to basically destroy as much of the enemy as possible. Maybe in a head-to-head game, face-to-face game against a human opponent, maybe I could see, maybe it would arise a serious consideration for retreat. Reserve, as you might imagine, reserve is a good command for moving, well out of range of the enemy. Muster is good when basically a unit has taken significant damage. So the orders system really makes the game play experience. The second thing that really gets me for this system is when you go in for melee, both sides, attacker first, then defender, units have to pass a morale check. And what that does is that basically adds a whole nother kind of level to combat resolution. Entirely morale based, leadership influenced, which all feels really good. Hugely unpredictable at times, and just really, well, to say the least, it feels right. Oh, there I went with that. Oof. All right, well, and in any case, well, I'll stop with the feeling thing. I got to discuss that separately, but it's just interesting. You can amass like 5 or 6 attacking units coming from, let's say, 3 different hexes, and half of them could fail their morale check, and basically they stall. They stall. They do not participate in the attack at all, and that can just really change things up. Like I said, highly unpredictable at times. Of course, it's not highly unpredictable if you're talking about units with morales of 8 and 9. But when you get down to 6 and 7 morales, or 5s, then it becomes highly unpredictable. And then the same thing for the defender. So those two things, the orders and the melee checks before, the morale checks before melee, really make, for me, the game experience here in the Royalist and Roundhead series. So I at least want to mention the issue of skirmish units retreating before combat. The rule says that skirmish units that retreat before combat, which actually in this case was really retreat before melee, but anyways, the rules say clearly skirmish units. Maybe I just figured it out. Okay, let me finish this, but actually I might have figured it out. Okay, the rules say skirmish units that retreat before combat cannot fire in the immediately following defensive fire phase. And get the wording just right. I know it's immediately following defensive fire segment. Okay. So we had this happen. Okay. The French units here basically pushed back this skirmish unit. I think it was this one. Anyways, somewhere here, I marked this unit to remind me that it cannot take part in the immediately following defensive fire segment. But what's weird here is that skirmish units that retreat before combat will always be the defenders. And if they're the defenders, then they're not the active player, which means that the immediately following defensive fire segment, if you move forward to the Spanish Papal player's turn next, well, they're not executing defensive fire. They would execute offensive fire. So are you going to loop back around again to the next French turn? And this unit cannot conduct defensive fire? I mean, that could be the intent, although the amount of time there I would have trouble with. But it doesn't matter because you will have already passed an offensive fire segment. So are the rules telling me that the skirmish unit that retreated before combat can fire in its next offensive fire phase segment, but not in its next defensive fire segment? That doesn't seem to make sense. Now, what just popped into my mind is, I don't know, maybe this retreat before combat is supposed to happen at the start of the combat phase, in which case that actually would precede defensive fire combat. On the one hand, that actually makes sense. On the other hand, that is clearly misplaced in the rules because this is under the melee procedure. Skirmish units and cavalry units which have a retreat or stand command being attacked by infantry combat units may now retreat 1 to 3 hexes. Skirmish units being attacked by cavalry or cavalry lancer units may only retreat before combat. On a die roll of 8, 9, or 10, the attacker must advance at least 1 unit into the vacated hex. Skirmish units which retreat before combat cannot fire in the immediately following defensive fire segment. That's way out of place in the rules, but that would actually make sense that it's out of place, though. Yeah, well, the rule as written is still incredibly confusing, but maybe that's what was intended. That's very confusing. Anyways, all I can do is note it and move on. So, under the skirmishers and command section, it's pretty clearly laid out. So now we're talking about skirmisher units specifically and what their restrictions and abilities are. They may retreat 1 to 3 hexes from enemy infantry unit zone of control before the combat phase begins. So that would be before fire combat. So that would be before defensive fire, the defensive fire segment. And incidentally, the rolling to retreat from enemy cavalry mounted units also specifies before the combat phase begins. So I guess that is the intent. That's really frustrating to me because I like in rules where I can just pull out, especially a rules section labeled procedure, arranged in steps, and I like to be able to follow it. But that means that this step number 3, skirmish units and cavalry units, etc., is way out of place, hugely misleading. Yeah, so actually, and what makes it frustrating is there basically is a whole nother step. I think I've discovered this before, and now I'm rediscovering it. There's really the combat resolved in the following order. The first step is really resolving retreat before combat, then defensive fire, then offensive fire, then melee combat. Yeah, I guess that's the intent. Well, at least that's somewhat doable, workable.